Welcome to 52 Living Ideas. I'm delighted with this new series that we have, The Switch. And today we've got Alex and Chase interviewing Josh Nass on amateur radio. Chase, over to you.
All right, let's get started. So I do like to start things off with a quote. One of the most important things you can do on this earth is to let people know they are not alone. And with that, I will introduce my guest for this week, our guest for this week, Josh Nass, known also as Hosh Nazi and KI6NAZ and Ham Radio Crash Course YouTube channel. Josh, welcome to The Switch.
Thank you very much for having me out.
So before we get into all things amateur radio, at least that we can hit, I want to start by rolling it back and getting into a little bit of your story. Tell us sort of, if you could divide your life into epochs, where I started, where I was then, where I am now. Give us as much of that story as you'd like to tell.
Sure. So, I wish it was a really fun and interesting story, but I'm born and raised in California, Southern California, lived here pretty much my whole life in outside of LA, grew up in a town called Whittier. Now I live in a town called Cerritos, about 9 miles down the street or so. I would say growing up, I kind of lived with just learning things and kind of understanding how things worked on paper. But for a long time, and it feels like until I got out of college, really, that I didn't feel like I could fail, that I had to learn a lot before actually trying to apply it into something, make something, and start being more confident in my abilities to create, if you will. I was a Boy Scout, so I learned a lot of outdoor skills and self-reliance things. I ended up becoming an engineer through college, trade. I've worked for aerospace companies. I'm a software developer now. But I found that as I've gotten older, I feel like either I got more confident or I got less fearful of just trying things and failing. And as I failed more, I learned more. And that seems to have kind of skyrocketed my growth and somewhat confidence in kind of where I'm at today and how kind of I do things on my YouTube channel and whatnot.
Nice. So how did you get into the amateur radio world, the ham world?
Back in 2000, around 2006, 2007, I was working for Boeing at the time. I no longer work for them, but I was working on a satellite ground station, so a lot of RF involvement. And my would become my Elmer, which is kind of ham radio lingo for a mentor, said, "Hey, you've got an interest in both the software that goes into some of this stuff, but a lot of the electronics components. You should take a look at amateur radio." And until that point, I had experienced it. When I was in Boy Scouts, there was a scoutmaster that had their license. And I remember a summer camp one year, and he had this radio, and what you're thinking in your head, a handy talkie type device. And we were all around our tents, and he's talking, and I don't know what he's talking to. I didn't understand at the time. And he was trying to relay to us, "Oh, I'm talking to a repeater." And again, maybe lost in translation or how he tried to explain it, I didn't really get it. I didn't really understand what he was doing. All I knew is that he seemed to be relatively interested in it and having fun with it. Years later, it wasn't until I kind of met this other engineer who became my mentor, where I said, "Oh, okay, I get it now. I kind of understand what this is all about." And then that led me to basically go to a store in Anaheim that's called the Ham Radio Outlet. They're all over the country, by the way. And I met another individual named Bob, and he kind of walked me through some of the radios, got me a book to study, to answer the questions, to then get or apply to take the test to get my amateur radio license, which is an FCC granted license.
Nice. And then, so how long was it before you started the YouTube channel from them? Like, what's the story between getting your first radio and deciding I'm going to talk about this stuff on YouTube?
That's a really interesting one. It's kind of a longer story, but I'll I'll try to keep it short.
I mean, take your time.
Sure.
Yeah.
In 2006, my wife basically told me, "You've got too many hobbies." At the time we were dating, and you know, you kind of like talking to people about things you're passionate about. Why don't you check out this crazy thing called YouTube? And I did. And so in 2006, I created a YouTube channel. And at the time, it had nothing to do with amateur radio because really I was still kind of introducing myself to amateur radio, still kind of learning, right, if you will. And so it was on things like hiking and gold prospecting, and you know, every once in a while I'd splash in a cigar review back when everybody was going to the cigar, you know, bars down the street. And that was 2006, and my YouTube has kind of been alive ever since then. And it was largely just a pursuit of whatever hobby I was into. For anybody that knows anything about YouTube, that's a sure shot sign that your channel really won't take off because it's just too many avenues of interest, too many things that people can't really latch onto and find something interesting and want to subscribe and follow you. What ended up changing things a bit was in 2015, I challenged myself to start doing daily videos. And so I would produce, you know, a 10-minute or 20-minute video a day. And I ended up doing that for over 600 days. And I learned a lot at that time. Really, what that helped me do was kind of refine my process for how I make videos. And I'm not pretending to be a filmmaker or anything like that, but just how I could efficiently convey my thoughts through the medium of video, right? And after kind of learning a process and kind of what I was interested in, and after experiencing kind of 600 days of trying to make content, I started to gravitate toward the things in my life that I found most interesting. And the one thing that I just kept going back to and had more fun with it was amateur radio. And that led me down the road of kind of thinking about it and wanting to convey my love of amateur radio to as many people as possible. And the best way I thought to do that was, why don't I explain to people how to get their license? In the United States, which differs country to country, but in the United States, we have three licensing systems. We have the technician, the general, and the amateur extra. And so I started out, just endeavored to walk people through the study guides that exist, taking practice tests to get your technician license. And somewhere along the way, people kind of got really engaged in it, and they really liked the weekly kind of show format where I would walk people through amateur radio in kind of this visual setting, because it allowed me to do things like, you know, demonstrate radios, kind of explain why using visual aids things work the way they work. And that led to then going on and making a course on the general class license for helping people get to that level. And then just lots of video reviews of radios, fun aspects of the different technical aspects to radio, because we'll talk about it, but radio is an incredibly large hobby with a ton of diversity. And really, just week by week, I produce a live stream video and then what I call a short form video, which is anywhere between 10 minutes to 20 minutes. And there's really no end to the content that I can produce, just because of how diverse the hobby is. So kind of I eventually got all the way back around to amateur radio, but it took me a little while. I've been on YouTube for over 10 years now, actually, you know, almost 15 years. So it's been fun.
Yeah. And so I want to highlight one of the principles that you actually basically said twice in two different ways, that when you started to started to have less fear of failure, you started to output more and your growth skyrocketed. Can you sort of talk about like what was it that made you realize, if I'm just less fearful of failure, if I'm just putting stuff out there, I can grow, or at least I'll get something different than I was getting before?
There's a couple of things. I'll give you the easy one, I think, first. One of the things that started to change through this paradigm shift was I bought a home, and I just had to like do a lot of work around the house. So I had to go research how to do it. And, you know, my dad wasn't around all the time. He was an extremely skilled handyman and mechanic. But I just realized, hey, I can do this. And I thought to myself, hey, tools are cheaper to buy than it is to hire somebody to do it for me. So I'll just start going down that path. And once I started doing that, not to say that that's completely adjacent with amateur radio, I started to learn like, hey, no, I can do this. And yeah, there's not just people that I can talk to, but the internet kind of changed everything. I found a lot of answers to my problems just from doing Google searches or, you know, whatever, finding websites I liked and kind of diving in a bit deeper. As far as how that changed with YouTube, obviously I started carrying that confidence over, and I realized at a certain point that for a lot of things, what do they say? The enemy of good is great. Now, of course, you want to produce the best content possible. You want to make really good content, but at the same time, I completely acknowledge the fact that I still have a career unrelated to YouTube and a family that demands a certain aspect of my time. So at a certain point, I just tell myself, hey, this is probably as good as it's going to get. If it needs to be revisited, we can come back to that. I can come back to that. And so I've kind of learned that with a lot of things, it's more of a marathon than a sprint. And so I take my time where I can to produce the best content I can, but at the same time, not producing it is worse than just putting something out there and say, hey, I did the best I could given the resources and time I have at this moment.
Was there any specific failure that you had that kind of changed your mind about that you were kind of hyping up in your mind, and then once it happened, you realized, oh, it's not so bad?
As far as the YouTube side goes, I had a bit of fear in doing the live streams. I really thought that being able to talk, largely just me, although I do interview people from time to time, that I would kind of like run out of ideas. And at some point you kind of get into what I call little mini ruts. But a lot of that time really just meant that, I could reach out to this community that exists that kind of that somewhat I created, and get ideas, get feedback from them. And that ended up bolstering me more than anything. Was just, if any time I feel like I'm not completely in love with the topic that I'm planning or thinking about planning, I just reach out to the community and say, hey, what would you like me to talk about? What would you like to see? And that oftentimes, will fill my calendar for a full month or more. So often whenever I feel like I've reached the kind of end of what I'm thinking about or what I'm planning, I just reach out to people and say, hey, what do you think?
Yeah, makes sense. I mean, that's similar to like a lot of marketing strategies of like, you from a meeting, you sort of book a meeting. It's reaching out to the other um, people in your network and not just trying to self-generate. Yeah, that's good. The mindset that you mentioned as well of like, I can learn to do these things myself, like from the house to the YouTube videos. That reminds me a lot of what Shrikant said a couple of weeks ago when we interviewed him about his sort of intellectual journey. I know before the show we were marveling at his bookshelf, and he basically said like at some point he figured out that he could learn himself. He could do the process of learning and understanding the world by going out into it and doing things. So cool. Okay. So now that we've gotten a couple of those interesting principles in there, I want to catch everybody up with what is ham radio. Like people, if they're not familiar, probably keep hearing this term and have no idea what we're talking about. Everyone's heard of radio. What is amateur radio? And give us that in comparison to like what people might be familiar with.
Yeah, so if you branch out from like your touch points that right? You get in your car, you may use your radio, but everybody listens to podcasts now on their phone. But that thing that's on the dashboard, right? You turn that on and it's using the antenna that's in your car. That's receiving a signal, right? You're receiving a broadcast station. And there's a ton of different aspects to that, what frequencies they're on and whatnot. Amateur radio kind of takes that model and adds the transmit capability. So with your FCC license, you're able to transmit. Everybody's able to receive. Anybody can go buy a ham radio to receive on, but it takes a license to be able to transmit. So with that license, we're allowed privileges on which frequencies we can transmit. I mentioned the 3 different classes of license earlier: technician, general, and extra. As you kind of climb the ranks, you get access to more frequency space, more areas that you can kind of put your radio on and transmit. So you kind of get the idea where I'm going with this. Is it's two-way communication from one side of the town to maybe the other side of the world. We can use our radios to communicate. I like to say it is self-supported communication. That seems to be a good way to explain to people. Everything that I use to communicate with someone else is solely under my control. Powering my station, the antenna I use to transmit and the radio I purchase or I build or I acquire in some way. And the other person I'm talking to is doing the same thing. We don't rely on really a service provider or a backbone. We just go, source to source, A to B. And that's a good way of looking at it. And it's done wirelessly. So it's all using radio frequencies to achieve that. And we can go
How would
way
that?
deeper than that, but keep going.
Yeah. So, how would that be different than, say, your hardware store to a FRS radio?
Great question. So FRS radios and what's called GMRS, so family radio service, those are like blister pack radios that you can purchase. And those radios are what they call type accepted by the FCC. The FCC says these radios, they'll have, 9 to 20 channels. They're channelized radios. They can only transmit on those channels. They have to meet the FCC standards for how much power they put out, what type of antenna they use, various other things. But at the end of the day, just with the people in this room, we would almost fill up all those channels of just two people wanting to just talk to each other, right? Well, all of a sudden we'd get in this situation where you've got multiple radios on the same channel and they're cross-talking with each other, and it gets really complicated. Again, going back to amateur radio, that is a frequency-based system. The operator is licensed, so they follow the principles and the safety guidelines of using radio on a very widespread space of frequencies. And we can have walkie-talkie type conversations like with FRS radios, or we can have larger antennas like something in your backyard that would allow you to talk across the country, across the state, a world really, depending on what you want to apply. So it's really a given set of frequencies that the FCC allows us to operate on for whatever particular communication demands we have at that time.
So, what are the reasons to get involved in amateur radio? Like, why would somebody decide to go through the licensing requirements, go through and take the test and study, and maybe even upgrade to the various levels? What's the point of that?
There's a lot of really good reasons. I'll try and cover a couple of them. A lot of people, particularly today, are finding amateur radio through kind of personal preparedness aspects. Again, going back to what I mentioned about, cell phones, right? Cell phones, I mean, we just had a major denial of service attack that happened today. Cell phones kind of stopped working. You weren't able to call people. Radio will never do that to you, right? You'll always be able to pick up your radio as long as it's in working order, and you'll be able to communicate with generally whoever you're trying to communicate with, although you'll be able to find someone. So people have started carrying them just for that aspect, not to mention people that go outdoors, maybe to areas where cell phones just were never reach. And that is always a good second kind of line of defense. Another aspect is that people just really seem to enjoy the hobby aspect of it. A lot of the times radios are something where we're building the antenna, or we're building some part of the radio that we then can put up on the air, going back to kind of what I said earlier of like making something, doing something on your own. That's pretty much all amateur radio is that, yeah, you can go buy like a turnkey radio station, but a lot of people get deep enjoyment, myself included, from getting your hands dirty and actually working on your radio, building your antenna, and going into that whole thing. Plus, there's just a massive community aspect to it. The ability to reach out under your own power, basically, and talk to someone in another country and have a discussion with them and basically create, a network, if you will. This community on the air is really interesting to a lot of people. Even in today's day and age, it's fascinating how many more people are getting into amateur radio when they start to understand like what you're capable of doing with it and the fun you can have.
Yeah, we'll get into why I got into it earlier. You actually mentioned it. I want to make sure we don't skip one of the questions that I was super interested in asking you, which is, what is it like the first time talking on a ham radio? And I've heard this term mic fright. I just got my license a week ago, and I have still yet to push the talk button. What happens? What is that like? And what was it like for you?
Yeah, it was scary the first time, for sure. I feel like I'm kind of I talk too much as it is, so I don't have a problem clicking a button before I do it. But most people experience mic fright, and particularly what's going on there is people worry too much about what they're about to say. There's really only a couple of things you have to worry about when you have a conversation on amateur radio, is that you use your call sign when you're starting the conversation. You use your call sign every 10 minutes after that point, and then you use your call sign when you wrap up the conversation. After that point, it's just a matter of being like, there's a certain level of niceties that we try to maintain in amateur radio. There are exceptions. There's bad apples, of course, in every hobby, but that's kind of the big thing. The piece of advice I give everyone when they experience mic fright is listen. Listen a lot. Generally, I listen probably 80% of the time than transmitting. I'm always trying to listen so I understand kind of how the flow of the conversation is going on. For technicians, for people starting out with the technician license, you're generally going to be probably talking on what's called a repeater. I kind of mentioned that when I mentioned the Boy Scouts before. A repeater is kind of like a radio that's on a building, tall building, or a hilltop. What the repeater is doing is when you key up that radio and you talk into it, it is taking your signal, it's turning it into a different frequency, and then kind of transmitting over a much broader area. So you, with your handy talkie, hit a repeater, it kind of amplifies it with more power and then transmits over a much larger space. So a repeater almost becomes like a community party line. There are tons of people that listen to repeaters, and since you can't see these people, since you know they're out there, you don't know who's out there, and you think about keying up and you're like, oh man, am I going to screw up? Am I going to make a mistake? The reality is that even really experienced people make mistakes. We do it all the time, and amateur radio is such that we're generally not that hard on each other. We are amateurs, meaning it's not professional, that we try and kind of maintain a certain level of niceties, but generally we're all kind of trying to learn more together and increase our knowledge of radio. So just try and have fun with it, expect that you will make mistakes. Often you'll find that the repeaters, particularly the good ones, have a really nice community of people that if you say, hey, I'm new, oh man, they'll open the doors for you, be extremely welcoming, and help you through the whole process.
So what does the day in the life of somebody who's using ham radio look like? Like, who are these people you're talking to? What are the conversations that you have? And are people doing like radio shows there? Is it a communication only?
It can be a myriad of things. I will focus on what most people experience when they're starting out. Again, you probably have a handy talkie that you're talking on, or they do. They maybe have a radio in their car. I know I have a couple radios in my car. And so I get in my car and, instead of turning on the radio or listening to a podcast, I will get on the amateur radio. I'll be able to hit the repeaters that are around me. We've got a breakfast net, as we call it, on one of the repeaters. And that's just really people talking about what's going on in their day, aspects of their life they're going through, hobbies that they're interested in. There's a lot of people talking about electric bicycles right now. Everybody's buying electric bicycles for getting some exercise or helping them along as they're trying to get some exercise. So it's really just kind of like, we call it the original social network. That's kind of what it is it's a party line where friends who weren't necessarily friends when they started out are now talking to each other, and there's kind of a daily rapport. Now that's the repeater side. That's the local side. We call that very high frequency VHF and ultra high frequency radio signals. That's line of sight communication, meaning that at a certain point that signal kind of starts to hit the curve of the earth and it doesn't bend. The same thing goes on with HF, shortwave radio. The difference there is that we're using a bit bigger radios, bigger antennas, and our signals are kind of bouncing off the ionosphere and coming back down. Well, the advantage of that is that now, instead of it just being your local community, you're talking to people across the country. And there are nets that exist every day. Same kind of idea. They'll start up in the morning. I have one that starts at like 7 a.m. my time, kind of drive time. And they're all over the country. And we get together on what's called 40 meters, which is a band about 7.155 megahertz is where this net meets. And they just kind of talk about what's going on in their day. Usually ham radio talk, like the radio guys like to talk about radios, so we talk a lot about radios.
Could do you think you guys could give us a little like rundown, like talk to each other as you would on a radio? I'm curious to hear like what these kind of formalities or rules are.
Okay.
Oh, you mean do
Well,
like a mock radio contact over Zoom?
Yeah.
I've got a prop. Hold on. I'll hold up my radio. You've got a radio.
Do my best.
Sure.
See,
What was it
so
called? Oh, I got it.
part of
KD2.
the part of
Go
the
ahead.
problem is I also this is, even though it's a mock contact, it'll still be my first contact where I'm talking. So you may have to walk me through some steps.
Yeah. Well, we're going to pretend this is on a repeater first, and this maybe we can
Perfect.
do a couple of these. But so I'm pulling out my radio. Maybe I'm driving in my car. I'm going to say KD2 TZU. This is Kilo India 6 November Alpha Zulu. Are you monitoring?
And I would say KD2 TZU, I hear you, KI6 NAZ.
Yeah, pretty much. And then the conversation would start at that.
Okay.
Or if I wasn't trying to call him, I could say something as simple as, this is Kilo India 6 November Alpha Zulu. I am doing a radio check, just making sure my radio can hit the repeater. How am I sounding? What's my signal report?
Good. KD2 TZU.
Yeah, it could be as simple as that. Now, if we're talking for a while, going back to what I was saying, is this is an FCC license, much like when you turn on the AM or FM broadcast and they give their call sign. Well, it's a similar call sign setup. We said 2 characters, a number, and then 3 letters. That's my FCC call sign granted to me. And Chase has his own, right? And so we would every 10 minutes or so, right? No more than 10 minutes, you say, KI6NAZ, back to you. And then the conversation would keep going. And then as we would wrap up the conversation, it would be something along the lines of, KD2 TZU, great talk we had today. I'll say 7 threes. This is Kilo India 6 November Alpha Zulu. And 73 is kind of the universal best wishes kind of term that we throw out in amateur radio.
Very cool. Yeah. Do you think part of the appeal is kind of getting into this new realm where there's a new set of rules, and it's almost like being a beginner all over again and being able to really feel yourself learning and growing and becoming competent?
I love that you asked that, because the entire hobby is that over and over and over and over again. So we just talked about handy talkies, right? This is just one step. You can become skilled in using these. And then there's the next step in, well, maybe now you're going to use an in-car radio. And so you have to learn that. But then when you decide to go to HF, high frequency, big antennas, the one that reaches across the country, that's almost a whole new paradigm. And that's just talking voice. All we did was talk about voice right now. I'm very active in data communication, where my computer connects to my radio and I transmit text, images, whatever, and it's across the world with that capability. That's one of my big passions in the hobby, and that's its own, first step. Then you get to the top, and then you look around and say, okay, where can I go with this? And then you're always doing that, because the hobby is so massively broad and diverse.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Do you see sort of and maybe the licensing requirement sort of filters this kind of attitude out, but like what you were just saying reminds me of, like, in martial arts, they talk about like white beltism or white belt syndrome, of like, you get to be a white belt in something again, where you're diving in, you're learning new stuff. It all seems foreign to you. There's just stuff to absorb. But in martial arts, like especially in something like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, white belts, there are basically 2 attitudes, right? There's the people who come in, they realize like they have that awakening that world is there, and they're open books. They're there to absorb everything. And then there are other people who feel crushed by it and are sort of driven out. Do you see that much, and how do you sort of deal with that as a community?
There's a couple of things I'll answer to that one. Generally, I find that there really are kind of 2 people in amateur radio as well. There's more than that, but let's talk about the 2. Instead of the kind that just kind of get crushed by it, I find that there's people who kind of find the thing that they really like, and then that's just what they do. They just become the black belt of that particular aspect, which is great. You know, that's more people to talk to. Then there are other people that's kind of more like me that as I find new things, new technology that we have kind of grafted onto amateur radio, that I get really interested in that, and I kind of go chase that down, and I kind of jump around a lot as my interests in it change and you know, whatever over time evolve. Going to kind of what you said about the tiered system, if you think about that as belts, the black belt in amateur radio, I like that. I am an amateur extra, so I guess I'm a black belt. But that system is built on privileges that you get access to. So when you're starting out, you generally have access to kind of what I mentioned, the VHF, UHF line of sight communication. That's your first level. Your sphere of influence, if you will, is kind of limited to that line of sight bubble of transmission capability that you have from your radio. When you get your general, which is kind of probably the big step, when you get to that level, that's where literally kind of the world opens up, because then you're able to really get on the HF frequencies and kind of really experience what amateur radio is really about, or what its legacy was and kind of still is growing today.
So I want to talk about preparedness and emergency comms. That's the big thing that got me into amateur radio. And the way I actually discovered your YouTube channel was through the Fieldcraft collab that you did with Mike Glover. We have him scheduled for next week, actually. And so let's just assume, actually, if you want to go over any like sort of preparedness principle, foundational stuff that applies, feel free. I don't, by no means am I limiting you from talking about that, but we are sort of having the conversation out of order, because I'm going to be asking him all about, you know, things like, why does it matter to be prepared for these various things? Like, what kind of mindset is this? Things like that. So if you want, let's just assume that we've already had that conversation. We've, you know, sort of gotten some of the foundation from sort of the principles of preparedness. And then let's talk emergency communications. Like, how does ham radio fit into sort of an overall strategy of preparedness?
It's kind of like the mother of all emergency communications that are accessible by civilians, pretty much. You know, to me, it is one layer of preparedness. It's a very large layer of communications preparedness, but it allows you to do so many things with it. It allows you to kind of what we already said, right? I can work with local people on the ground with their radios. I can talk to them directly. You know, I gave an example. I did a video, like a 3 or 4 part series on emergency communications. And in the second video, I mentioned that I'm a member of CERT. What is that? Community Emergency CERT.
Community Emergency Response Team.
Response team. Thank you.
Yep.
And as a part of that team and working with those people, there's an easy situation when you're canvassing a neighborhood after an emergency where you probably can just hand a radio to someone if they have the skill in it. Hopefully they would be a radio amateur, that we could relay information very quickly back and forth to wherever your base station is. And that base station could have an appreciable antenna with enough power output that you could then contact emergency services. And there are amateurs that kind of embed themselves with the sheriffs, with local hospitals. There are emergency teams that are based around amateurs that we can interoperate with when power's out, cell phones are gone, internet's gone. All of that is kind of like where amateur radio shines. And that's why it gets brought into disaster areas a lot, is they can kind of be the first communication as the grid starts to pick back up. And so I just mentioned kind of 3 or 4 different types of radio just in that quick little synopsis. So having a handy talkie in your kit, of course, being an amateur is preferred here because then you can practice with it, right? Going back to, hey, you talk to your friends every day. Well, what does that make you? It makes you more comfortable on the radio. In an emergency, you won't have to pull up the manual and go, what's the frequency again? Where am I supposed to be talking on this? You have the skill to operate with it when, it's a high stress situation during an emergency, right?
Right. Yeah. There's that idea. We don't rise to the occasion. We fall to our level of training. And so to me, that's it exactly, is like the reason to get the license is not because in an emergency you need a license. It's because in an emergency you want to have practiced already. You want to be comfortable enough that the learning curve of the mechanics of operating an emergency is already done with. Now you just have the emergency to deal with.
Exactly. And you want to give yourself the best chance possible of getting the help or helping others that you can. And really, the best part about this is good news. This is a whole lot of fun while you're doing it. It's not like a painful thing that you have to experience or that it's a very difficult test. It's not at all to get started. And I bet you, if you're kind of a technical mind or curious, just curious about how things work, kind of learning, scratching the surface on how radio frequencies work, what they do, how radios work. When you start looking at that, it's fascinating, and it starts to just drive itself as you look at it. You're like, oh man, you just kind of want to go to the next thing and learn more about it.
Yeah. Are there historical examples of people of hams operating in emergencies, and sort of what did that look like?
Yeah, there's a couple different examples. Well, I did a couple different shows on this, but the ones that leap to mind, there's generally two things that can occur. One, someone kind of hurts themselves, like they're hiking, or they hurt themselves in an area where there is no cell phone. And they'll either have an amateur radio operator kind of in their group, or there will be an amateur radio person that stumbles upon them, or somehow they'll get an amateur involved. And that amateur will end up pulling out the radio, calling out to the repeater, like the repeaters we mentioned earlier, and saying, hey, I need help. I've got somebody, they got stung by a bee. They're going into shock. They're allergic to bees. And that person on the repeater that takes that call can then take their cell phone or, whatever, and call the first responders and help get them to that location, right? There's multiple different examples of that. Two that come to mind. There was one in Catalina Island where somebody had fallen, and that person, a couple, kind of went to where this person had fell and ended up getting help that way. There was another one in the UK where a young girl went into, had a seizure, I believe, and they ended up getting help, again, through calling for help, hitting a repeater, and getting the first responders to them. The flip side of that, and there's a bunch of examples of that, but the flip side of that is where you actually have people that will deploy. These are usually part of these emergency groups. We'll probably talk about them in a little bit later, but ARES is one of them. RACES is another one. And there's different acronyms that go along with that. Those people usually are teams that are equipped with specific radios and specific capabilities, and they'll take them to like islands that have been pretty much devastated as far as their grid's concerned after hurricanes. The hams there, often the people that live there and the people that come to there with equipment, will likely be the first ones to get repeaters back on the air. They, with their capabilities and what they know in radio, they were able to bring repeaters back online, bring communication back, get communication into hospitals so that they were able to, handle the emergency medical care in those situations.
One of the things so Chase has always been into preparedness, and ever since we were in, roommates together. And I think I would always kind of wonder what's going to happen to you? Like, why are you so, invested in being so prepared for everything? And I think one of the things I've learned from talking to him, and I think just from your stories you just mentioned, a big part of it is about helping others and being able to, if you, with the amount of people you're around, it's probably more likely that you're going to run into somebody else having a problem than you are, just by, numbers, just,
Sure.
So I think it's interesting to think about what is like the overhead for somebody who would want to learn this of time. So what would it take? How much time and effort? And what type of person do you think would benefit the most based on their environment, where they live, um, what they, yeah, I guess that's the only kind of qualifier I can think of, but
Yeah. These are all really good questions. I feel like there's a much larger answer, and we could go really deep with them. Generally, it's not that expensive to get your license. You don't need to buy a radio to get your license, by the way. A website comes to mind. It's the one I recommend everybody go to, hamstudy.org. They have a online kind of courses you can take, and there's online testings. There are sample tests, so you can kind of practice before you go take the test. It's all free, by the way. That's the best part about their website, is it's free. And then if you decide you want to get your license, a big thing that's happened, it's kind of a positive, I guess you can look at it, from COVID-19. Before, how you get your license is you'd have to find a local club. You'd have to physically go to that club, and you'd have to take the test. And then you'd have to wait for that club to put it in an envelope, ship it off to the FCC, and then they'd update the database, and boom, you got your call sign. Now we are testing online, actually via Zoom. So we take the volunteer examiners, we get them in a Zoom call, and we watch the participant, the person taking the test, and we had something fall over in my garage right now. Sorry about that. Then they take the test, and we kind of use the online, the webcam and whatnot, to run them through the process. And so you can get your technician, general, and extra class all online now. And the only thing you have to pay, if not free, a lot of places are completely free. So right now this costs you nothing, is at most like $15. And that's just kind of a administrative cost. Now, as far as radios are concerned, getting into radio has kind of never been cheaper, but it's also never been more expensive at the same time. And I'll kind of break that down a bit. About 2015, we got introduced to Chinese radios. A lot of Chinese radios started hitting the market. They're called Baofangs, right? Everybody's probably, well, if you're familiar with radio, you might have heard the term Baofeng. But there are others along those lines too. And what they are is very inexpensive radios. And they kind of have become the entry drug to amateur radio, because for like as little as $25 to $30, you can have one of these radios, and you can start, again, before you have your license. Don't transmit, that would be illegal. But before you have your license, you can use that radio to listen to what's out there. And there's a lot out there. It's more than just kind of the amateur radio spaces, but even in the amateur radio spaces, there's so much going on often. Depending on where you live, it can vary. And then from that point, it does start to get more expensive, particularly as you get into HF. And what can sometimes make things really expensive is and it's a good thing, because amateur radio and amateur radio operators in general are so interested in not just enhancing their own radios or enhancing radio as kind of an art form and a hobby, they're also really, really good at adapting technology that already exists. And things have progressed from, vacuum tubes in the beginning all the way up to software-defined radios now. And some of these whiz-bang software-defined radios can do so much, because often they have basically a computer embedded in them. And we have the capability now to have really, really cool stations. Sometimes they're very expensive, but we have more capability kind of than we ever had with radio. And it's really, I say, a great time to be alive in radio because of the options we have, starting at the very inexpensive and then going all the way up to the more expensive.
how about from a time commitment standpoint, from getting into it to getting your license and being able to transmit?
So if you're pretty passionate about it and you spend, 10 to 30 minutes a day on it, and I think that might even be pushing it. I'd say within 2 weeks, you could go test for your license to get your technician license, and you'd be good to go. And really then at that point, you're kind of always learning, I say, regardless of where you think you are. There's always something new you learn within radio. And from that point, then it's just, well, do you want to go to general, or do you want to kind of stay in technician land and have some fun? Because there's so many things you can do there. There are amateur radio satellites that can use, the radio that Chase was holding up. You can use that to talk to a satellite as it's passing overhead. It kind of acts like a repeater that's really, really high up. So you could technically talk to other states via the radio. And, that's nothing more than that Baofeng and getting your technician license really to kind of get into that and start exploring it. And if you want to improve your station and get better at operating those satellites, so, just you can build your own antenna, or you can possibly buy a better radio. So it's pretty broad in that sense. It starts to really kind of open up.
Are there any like legal exceptions for transmitting in the case of an emergency?
There is. This question has come up a lot lately because I've been asked many, many times, hey, aren't we in a kind of a national emergency? Can I just use my radio? The answer is no. You have to be in pretty close to great bodily harm, or someone is there and is in imminent chance of death. And then you can use the radio to call out on almost any frequency. This isn't just amateur radio related, but almost any frequency you can call out on. I would actually argue any frequency you can technically do, but there's some kind of gray areas in that. I will say this though. If you have been putting off getting your amateur radio license because you've been thinking, I'll just use it in a time of emergency, then I would just fall back on what Chase said. You don't rise to the emergency, you fall back on what your level of competence is. And if you have not been using the radio, even as simply as talking to your buddies on your morning drive time, you will not be able to rise to the situation of whatever emergency is at hand. It is something you must practice, just like you have to practice first aid, just like you have to practice the myriad things that go into being personally prepared for, whatever you're planning that could happen. It's just like that. It's in the same wheelhouse as that. It's a skill, and you must kind of learn to be the best operator you can.
Alex, did you have a? Sorry, I didn't want to cut you off. If you had another one. Okay, so can we go through? I mean, again, my mind is on the preparedness track. Can we go through maybe a couple levels of, like, if you're somebody who has never really considered a lot of these sort of aspects of being prepared for different types of emergencies before, let's go through sort of a couple levels of what you can do to have a plan and have some pieces of that plan in place so that, if something happens, you're prepared. So maybe at the smallest level, like what can you do just in terms of your local area, maybe your family, your neighbors, things like that?
I've got a couple. Well, first, this really doesn't even start out with amateur radio. My recommendations don't start there. Generally, I really recommend everybody has just a general coverage receiver, an AM, FM broadcast radio. This one happens to do weather as well as shortwave and some other nifty features. You want to listen if something were to happen. You want to be able to gather as much information as you can. You kind of want to get a situation report of what's going on at the local level. And one of the best ways you can do that is just listen to the broadcast frequencies, AM, FM frequencies. If you have a scanner, right? Scanners don't require a license. A scanner that is capable of listening to, not just police, but your first responders, even public works is a good thing to have for understanding what's going on around you. But then going back to, what we said about the Walmart blister pack FRS radios, if you find a couple of them that are cheap and of appreciable quality, why not buy 4 or 5? Why not ask your neighbors to buy the same radio and say, hey, have a couple of these. Let's break them out every 4 months, every 6 months, and we'll do a quick check just to keep our skills, from getting completely dull. And now you've got kind of a local network of people. Hopefully these are like-minded people that kind of also want to be a little bit prepared for an emergency. So you've got kind of your communications at the broadcast level, pulling in emergency broadcasts, whatever from the government / first responders and any news reports going on. Then you layer that with people, either your close family members, local community in your neighborhood. Now you have kind of local coverage for people that might need help, or you yourself might need help. You'll be able to communicate with them without relying on your cell phones, which, even if the networks don't go down, almost all cell phones in the time of a proper disaster have become overloaded to the point that reliable communication becomes difficult with them. So it's not that much money to say, hey, I can have an AM FM receiver and a couple of FRS radios and be like, hey, okay, that's something. The next level is where you kind of commit to going and getting your license and kind of going down that path of amateur radio. And really what that does is it opens up greater transmit power. FRS is like maybe one at most, I think 1.5 to 2 watts. Whereas, a handy talkie for amateur radio is generally 5 watts or higher. And from there, we have access to 50 watt radios, 100 watt radios, and then we have amplifiers where we can get, big power out of an antenna. And then all of a sudden, you're not only just intercommunicating with your neighborhood, you're actually communicating on a wider level that you could be directing traffic in a net situation where you're taking in people that need help and finding the connection for them. I give the example of, you're in your neighborhood, somebody on their FRS radio calls you and says, Mrs. Smith down the street, she's on an oxygen machine. The power's gone. Does somebody have a generator? Well, nobody in the neighborhood has a generator that's available. What do we do? Well, you hop on the repeater that are oftentimes solar powered, has a battery backup, or just use your more powerful station and say, does anybody have a generator we can borrow for, however long? Or maybe they have a generator, but they don't have gas. Who has extra gas? So all of a sudden, it's not just about like, I must get first aid medical attention to person A. It is, hey, we're going to be dealing with this for like a week. What do we need to make sure everybody stays okay for that amount of time? And it could be as simple as like, I need a generator, right? Or refrigeration, right? If they need insulin. Yeah, that's an example.
Yeah, I think about when Alex and I were in Boston in college, and that was at the time of the marathon bombing. And as we were out watching the marathon a couple of blocks away, and as soon as that happened, we both, I think Alex or one of us had left our phones back at our dorm. And so we had one cell phone between the two of us to very quickly call our families and let them know something's happening. We're okay. We'll keep you updated. And I don't know if it was the cell phones getting overloaded. I don't know if it was police trying to shut down towers for fear of cell phone activated other explosive devices, whatever it was, for whatever reason. At some point shortly after things kicked off, people were not able to get calls out. So, and if that had been, luckily that was not an extended period of time where people were not able to get calls out. But if that had been, that would be really hard, even just from a, keeping our families in the loop perspective. That would be very hard to do with the infrastructure that is in place versus a zero infrastructure solution like radio wouldn't have been affected.
Yeah, and again, going back to it, you're depending on their network. You're depending on AT&T's network, Verizon, whomever, and it can be turned off, as you mentioned, by first responders, police, military can have that turned off. We can deny access to it ourselves by everybody trying to spam it as fast as possible with calling people, which happens. I live in Southern California. Every time there's an earthquake, it dies on you. There are multiple examples on why you could not have access to a cell phone. So if you just cut the middleman out of it and you become solely responsible with the communication by having, a radio this size in your backpack, yeah, it's extra work, right? You have to take the test, you have to have the radio, and you have to have the wherewithal and the knowledge to use it. At the same time, I would argue that I'm not just doing it for this hypothetical situation. I'm doing it because it's a lot of fun. Yeah. There are plenty of aspects to it that are super, super interesting and, relative to the things I already do. Like there's an aspect of amateur radio I do that is solely based on hiking to the top of mountains and then making contacts with people. And it's like Pokemon for mountains, we call it. It's nice. Pokemon go to the top of a mountain and make radio contacts. And that's the super passion kind of thing for me is that's HF radio as well as the handy talkies. And it's gets you outdoors, you have a lot of fun with it, and you still get to kind of flex that muscle because you're basically operating kind of an emergency station, but on a mountain. So you have to be solely 100% self-reliant when you go out in the field and do that. And you got to have your kit pretty squared away to do it as well.
Yeah.
I live in Fort Lauderdale in Florida, and with the kind of culture in my age group down here, I'm trying to imagine myself going over to the neighbors in my apartment complex and trying to hand them a radio. You guys need to have this.
I would argue that you would already have to know these people before you just start handing out radios. But hey, Halloween's coming up.
Yeah.
Trick or treat, here's a radio.
True.
Yeah, I was thinking similarly along the lines of like my network. So I'm in New York City, and in terms of radio, just the mechanics of radio wave propagation in the city, there are obviously differences. HF maybe you could achieve it, I'm sure, at some point if you maybe put an antenna on top of a building. But if I'm walking around at street level, I'm basically stuck with VHF, UHF, and sort of what my plan should be in terms of like my network, my friends who might be, over in Brooklyn or Queens or a different part of Manhattan or New Jersey, trying to put that together. That's been an interesting challenge.
It's very difficult. I've tried to work with some people that live in New York as well, and depending on how surrounded you are by the large buildings in that area, not even a large building, just a lot of buildings, makes it difficult sometimes for the signals to get to where you're going.
Yep.
The best thing you can do often is try to get up on the top and get an antenna up there, and that will do better for you. But those are serious difficulties that exist in that particular environment.
Yeah. I've been able to listen to a lot of repeaters around here, but like I said, I haven't tried transmitting. So at some point I'm going to be, taking somewhat diligent notes on what repeaters I can actually hit, and, how good a contact I can make and where. So
I've always, going back to the mic fright thing really quick, and then I'll let you go to the next one.
Sure.
If you guise it under, like, starting your first contact, if you guise it under saying, give your call sign, just wanted to check and make sure I'm hitting the repeater. How do I sound? Because then it's really more about the technical capability of your radio. It's not about you talking, your skill in talking. It's, hey, let's talk about this radio. Is it good? Is it bad? How do I sound? Right? And then that moves into an easy discussion, a first break the ice kind of conversation. So that's what I always recommend people start with.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I want to go one level up in the preparedness sort of chain here. Let's talk about some of those organizations that you mentioned, sort of ARES, RACES. What are those? What does that space look like? And how do you start to get involved in more organized systems of emergency comms?
So the big one that I generally recommend is the ARRL, which is the American Radio Relay League. Is kind of like the United States membership service that kind of looks out and protects amateur radio. They're kind of like our lobbying body. They try to make sure that, because again, the frequencies that we're all trying to share the same frequencies, businesses, the military, governments, amateur radio. There is no more frequencies to hand out. The DC to daylight space of radio is finite, and the FCC manages who can talk on what. And so the ARRL kind of helps out in lobbying for things like that. But also they have a huge community outreach system for many different things. But one of the things they do is ARES, which is Amateur Radio Emergency Service. And I kind of hinted at that when I was talking about individuals that have gone into like hurricane or disaster areas with radio equipment. They have local groups that are usually based off of your ARRL division, and they take members, generally amateur radio operators themselves, and they do drills for kind of similar to what we've been talking about, certain situations where you'd have to transfer information back and forth, like what's needed here. We have somebody hurt over here. They often support things like foot races. Foot races are a big deal for radio. In fact, the Boston Marathon still uses amateur radio as one of the methods that they use for brokering information back and forth, particularly for the runners who are EMS specialists. They will have a radio operator tethered with them, and they'll stay in constant communication with the kind of radio HQ area or the incidents commander. But specifically, these teams are built around the concept of preparing for emergency situations that can happen. They can meet monthly or, bi-monthly, and they will, again, go for races, support them, different sporting events, as well as these mock examples. There's another one called RACES, and it's literally spelled races, basically. And I believe that is the Department of Homeland Security. It's kind of a hard one to Google because if you search for races, you get actual races. So
Right.
you have to add like DHS into it. But I always recommend people check out ARRL's ARES, because there's usually a division in your area or there's some kind of activity that you can get involved, much like you can with CERT, which is the local community emergency response team we mentioned earlier. And some CERT teams will also have kind of a radio adjunct to it that you can get involved with. Some do, some don't. The sheriff's department, they sometimes have a radio emergency team as well. That is usually a volunteer-based system that has civilians in it as well, depending on the different aspects of things they're doing. And usually it's an emergency response team as well. So it's really going to depend on your area and what's active in your area.
Cool. Yeah, the New York CERT application just says, "Are you a licensed amateur?" And I'm sure that they've got roles for hams. Haven't started diving into that too much yet, but I'll get there. Cool. So I want to, in the interest of time and the audience and all of this, I want to transition to our next section. But first, I want to make sure, Alex, do you have any other questions that you wanted to hit before we move on?
No, I think I'm all good. I think I got the pitch.
Cool. Josh, are there any other points that you feel we should hit in terms of amateur radio or any of the topics that we've been hitting that you feel like we just want to get to before we move on?
I would go back and to one question I don't think I answered, which Alex, I think, asked, is kind of who is the person that might be interested in amateur radio. I think we hit the emergency preparedness type for sure. And I definitely talked about those that kind of, I don't want to say are looking for a community to join, but are interested in other avenues of communicating with people. I know that's not really a thing people think about. It's like, hey, I can just hop on Facebook now. But at the same time, the other group that I think is really goes kind of hand in hand with radio, particularly whatever project you're working on, is the maker community, the hacker community, that kind of stuff. There's the Venn diagram, a lot of overlap on that. The maker community alone, there's just a massive maker aspect to amateur radio, making your own antennas, making your own radios. And then oftentimes they have parallels in other things where your mission, for example, is, let's say you're a drone operator. Well, you can get your amateur radio operator license, and then you can use your amateur radio to communicate with your drone. The different bands of operation for the transmitter that you use for your drone, you can make some of them, not all of them, work with amateur radio. So you can kind of leverage the two together. There's a myriad other examples like amateur radio positioning systems that we use. Those are little kits you can buy, and people use those to, put a beacon on their pet to make sure that they find their pet at the end of the day. And these are little homebrewed things that they can build. You can build at home. So maker community, hacker community is a big aspect of amateur radio as well.
Cool. Yeah, actually, we'll talk about it potentially later. I just got a Raspberry Pi. I have ideas for what to do with it, but
there's so many projects for amateur radio. It's really cool. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Cool. So quick note to anybody that's here watching. We got a couple of people in Zoom. If you do have questions for Josh or for me and Alex on this topic, on whatever topics that you want related to this, feel free to pop them in the chat. We will sort of call on you. You get to unmute, ask the question yourself, or we can ask it for you if you want. So feel free to start typing some of those questions there. But first, we will move on to a segment that we like to call the off topic. For anybody that has not listened to The Switch before, the off topic is a segment where we ask our guests to bring up a topic that is not directly related to the main topic, although often it does circle back around. That's okay. Sometimes it's a hobby, a philosophical idea, something someone said to you in line at the grocery store. It really can be anything at all. We'll do maybe 5-10 minutes on it at most. So, Josh, what do you have for us?
I came up across this, and it was more of an interesting curiosity to me. And hopefully it's not a too downer of a subject, but my wife is extremely not concerned, but very proactive in following what's kind of been going along with the statistics with COVID-19, cases of people getting COVID-19 and unfortunately passing away from COVID-19. And she relayed to me, I think it was yesterday, that we have, and this is WHO numbers, we have passed, as far as people passing away, deaths from COVID-19, we've passed malaria in the world. And I was always taught that malaria is an absolute killer of people. It's the mosquito is like the deadliest animal. And COVID-19, this kind of thing that hit us completely out of the blue, no vaccinations or anything like that. So I'm building to my curiosity. But I mentioned that I'm in Los Angeles County. I'm in the southeast portion of Los Angeles County. I'm basically the last city before you get to Orange County. I have friends that live in Orange County. I have lots of people that are there. And I found this kind of, I don't know what's causing it, but this trend of people that are no longer thinking about COVID-19. And in the OC particularly, people not wearing masks. And being that I am kind of emergency minded, my concern is kind of how did we get to this point? And I obviously know there's a lot going on politically now in the environment, but what is it about human nature that you start to get what they call like emergency fatigue? You just get to a certain point where what is being asked of you, you just start getting lackadaisical on it. Maybe I won't wash my hands as often as I did a week ago, or, make sure I wash my mask, etc. So it's kind of a, not so much philosophical, but a question I have with humanity is how do we get to this point? And maybe it's just because we stop seeing people we know that get it, that we think, okay, we can move on. It's no longer a problem. But then I see numbers like that my wife showed me, and I don't know what to do. I don't know how to respond to that. I don't know how to get people to think, critically about stuff like this or objectively at the data.
Yeah. So just for me to chime in, so I mentioned I live in Fort Lauderdale, and the basic sentiment here is that it's over. Like, the beach is absolutely packed. Nobody's wearing a mask. People shoulder to shoulder at all the bars. And I mean, obviously, like you said, there's so many factors that go into people just deciding that, they're just going to go out and, whatever. But I think the biggest thing I saw is just like a social influence. Like, they see one of their friends stop wearing the mask, and then like, yeah, I don't need to be around that. And it's just like the slippery slope, right? And then all of a sudden they're out at a restaurant and they're 6 feet apart, but then a friend comes up and now they're not 6 feet apart. And it just kind of, from what I've seen, that's the biggest factor that kind of unravels people's, more logical thinking, I think.
Yeah, I think emergency fatigue is a good term for it. I haven't heard that before. From my experience in New York City, it depends. It depends on where in the city you are. In my neighborhood up here, it's sort of been on and off at the beginning. It took a long time for people around here to start wearing masks and to start seeing hand sanitizer everywhere in grocery stores. Some of that's a supply issue, but I think it was also a will issue that people didn't want to do that. And then you saw it everywhere. And just in the past week or so, you start seeing it taper off. And that's really unfortunate because this neighborhood of New York and New York in general, I mean, we're not out of the woods by any means. But just last weekend, we went to walk down by the riverside, obviously with our masks, expecting to social distance. And there are barbecues and birthday parties, people who have masks that are hanging off of their faces, and
Yeah,
they're
that underneath the chin job.
right, or just on the table next to them, like not even trying. And it's an interesting psychological thing to see. Like I don't blame any of those people, because it's clearly like it's no, I don't see it as an individual person's sort of moral failure to be a part of that sort of community consciousness of we're tired of going out with masks, right? That's emotionally and intellectually fatiguing to try to figure out what you should be doing moment to moment in order to be sort of the best you can be in terms of protecting yourself and your community, right? There is absolutely a fatigue aspect to that. But the idea that we can go out and have barbecues and birthday parties in the park with, 50, 60 people gathered around with no masks, like in my mind, just looking at the numbers, just looking at what's going on and how this thing spreads, we're not at that point by any means. And it is absolutely an interesting psychological phenomenon that's happening.
Yeah, I know people who've died from it. I know people who've caught it and they were in the hospital. They've thankfully recovered. And a month before it all kicked off, my stepdad had a lung transplant, and a month before that, my father had a gallbladder removed. So I'm on DEFCON 9 when it's about my family. But I see, as you mentioned, the Facebook posts, the social media posts of people going out. And I get it. I get it. I don't want to be in my house anymore. I don't want to keep doing this. But at the same time, I look back to Memorial Day that was just about 2 weeks ago. And particularly here close by me, Huntington Beach, there was, shoulder to shoulder people out protesting for, at the time, that protest was for the telling people to stay home. And I've noticed now, again, with my wife tracking these numbers, that it's starting to creep up again as far as new cases. And so, at the end of the day, I guess we're all just trying to balance the influx of people that go to the hospital. So as long as that's happening, I guess we're achieving something. But I do worry about people like my two dads. I guess you could say my stepdad and my biological father. But it's just an interesting human trait. And specifically, I was focusing on that emergency fatigue, or Joseph, I see in the chat, wrote compassion fatigue, which I hadn't seen that. And there's a Wikipedia article that I will look up after the fact here. So thank you for sharing that. But I just find it an interesting kind of human trait.
I think the other factor that I'll mention that I see from talking to people who are experiencing this a lot and just really don't care about the masks anymore is that the information that we're getting, it's hard to make sure that your source of information is, one, giving you something credible, but two, giving you something you can understand what to do with. It's really, really hard when, like last week, the WHO had this person who was speaking about something very specific about asymptomatic transmission, when that term has been used for, and there's a confusion between asymptomatic and pre-symptomatic, and like some of this is scientific language. Sometimes the terms mean something different in the scientific community than the sort of at-large public. And just the fact that is not being communicated clearly, I think contributes a lot to this fatigue.
Yeah, I think that would be a part of it too. I think at the same time, it would be important to remember that, hey, a lot of this is happening for the first time, or we're
Sure.
kind of going through this the first time. And I think, obviously when you look to the government, you think, oh, but you've got to have all the answers. Well, maybe not so fast. They're not they're coming at this for the first time on a lot of this stuff. And to me, maybe that falls back on, I hate to go back to the topic, but why would I carry a radio? It's maybe I think about that just a little bit further on what could happen, or maybe due to my experiences growing up in Southern California with the earthquakes and losing power, losing gas, natural gas, all that stuff, that there's kind of like an extra level of caution, I guess. So if I think there's something bad, this big bad unknown wolf of COVID-19, for example, that I'm not really that, I don't care as much who says. I kind of get the idea it's bad. And so I'm just going to say, okay, mask all the time, regardless of what you're doing, mask all the time, and then keep that extra layer. But it's the shirking of the mask and the complete 180 that seems to have happened that I'm specifically focusing on. Is like, wow, that is an interesting thing to see kind of firsthand.
Yeah, I also see just a lot of, confirmation bias too with one, screenshot of a news story that gets shared, like you mentioned, or Chase mentioned with that, WHO question like a week ago, like, oh, masks are ineffective, shared, that's what I thought, and it just becomes like common knowledge among, insulated groups, and it's just, it's hard to, like you said, it's hard to fully know what to believe or think, or when to be aware that you may be in an echo chamber, which I know Chase and I talk a lot about, and the whole podcast of idea of the switch of assuming that there's something incorrect that you believe, or a better way to perceive things or learn about things. So that's a good off topic.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, that was good. All right. You ready to move on to questions?
Oh, I love questions. That's like my
Sweet.
favorite thing.
All right. So the first question is from Charles Stacey Harris III, who I'm smiling because that's my dad, and I don't call him by his name. Charles, do you want to ask your question? Oh, I got to unmute you.
Thank you for unmuting me. Yeah, so it was just a silly question of, have you ever talked to the International Space Station? And if so, was it the coolest thing ever?
That is a fantastic question. The answer is no, but I will go into a little bit of depth there. Part of the reason is there's a group called ARISS. It is Amateur Radio International Space Station, or something along those lines. And it's a group of amateurs that goes to different schools. And there's different groups, and they go to different schools around the country. And they're, public schools. I believe it's middle school through high school. Sometimes they do elementary, but I'm not sure. Go to their website, search ARISS. And you can find out more. But most of the contacts that they organize with the ISS, they try to line up with those ARISS events so that they can get kids talking to the astronauts, which I think is fantastic. There are rarer situations where the astronaut will stay on after the ARISS contact and work with amateurs that are listening. Rarer still, and this is much rarer than it used to be, where they will just get on the air and communicate with people. You have to be monitoring their frequencies a lot, and you have to have kind of an antenna system that kind of tracks the ISS. Or you're going outside with an antenna and you're waving it around, freaking your neighbors out on what's that guy talking to. Because literally the pass is about 9 minutes. So if you didn't hear them, whoop, next 9 minutes. The plus side of this is they have a repeater system on board the ISS for APRS, which is the automatic positioning radio system. And what that allows you to do is you can take your radio outside. I don't have my radio that does it in front of me, but you can send a packet of data. It sounds like a burst, like a fax tone, up to the satellite, the ISS, and it will take that and then downlink it. And so you will actually be brokering communication via the ISS through its APRS digipeater, which is really cool. So you can have like a two-party conversation, two people on the ground that you're doing through the ISS, which is pretty fun.
Nice. The next question is from Sean Coffey. Sean.
I was wondering how you could use, or how you compare ham radios with satellite radios in an emergency situation. What are the benefits of one, and what are the negatives of the other, and how they compare? Thanks.
Great question. A lot of people, particularly those that go outdoors, out here we have the PCT trail, the Pacific Crest Trail, which is like the 3-month quit your job, go from the border of Mexico all the way up to Canada. A lot of people there carry the satellite Help Me transponders. Those are great because they go straight to a satellite and then you can get the help you need. Most of the time they don't have any issue. They're good. The only question you have is how much do you trust that service? If it's just you that's calling for help and it's not, saturated with people calling for help, then fine, it's a great system. Ham radio, if you're down in the middle of a valley surrounded by mountains all around you, not going to work that great if you need help. That's, spoiler alert, that's probably not going to be the best thing. You're going to have to find somebody to help you that's a bit local, or they can relay your comms up and out if you're in that type of situation. However, you do need help. You can go up on the mountaintop or a hill, and you can make a longer contact to like a repeater or something like that to get help. Ham radio is generally 100% terrestrial when it comes to the VHF, UHF radios we talked about. So I would argue for both of them, to be honest. The satellite transponders are going to help for you getting help, or maybe someone getting help. That's not going to be a cheap affair. That whole thing. And plus, that's usually a service that you have to pay for. In some cases, it can be more reliable than amateur radio. If you were more in a suburban situation where you needed help, that may not be the time to use the satellite system. It's going to depend on the situation. But there's definitely situations where satellite is going to be better than amateur radio in certain cases.
Awesome. Next up is Ed. Ed, you're going to have to unmute yourself. Let's see. There you go.
Yeah, about 40 years ago, there was a huge craze for CB radios, and I and most of my friends were very actively involved. We drive around and we communicating with many different types of people. We had a community with truckers, and this is all the way from Syracuse, New York, to Queens. And it was really incredible. And we monitored many difficult situations. In fact, I was once rescued. I was in a snowbank in Quebec, and I was able to use my CB radio, and a farmer came and got me out of the ditch. And I don't know what I would have done without the CB. It was an incredible phenomenon, but it just sort of disappeared by the 90s, and it was no longer a factor. But I never saw such a level of community involvement, and I really loved my activities with the CB group.
CB is fantastic. It hasn't gone anywhere, by the way. You can still get a CB radio, and you can still do that. I would just put it more towards the FRS radio, GMRS radio type situation. It's a channelized radio system. So you're all on the same channels with all the other people that have CBs. Oftentimes that's not a problem. There's plenty of space to go around. The other thing, we didn't really get into it because it's a pretty technical discussion. Our sun goes through 11-year cycles, and undoubtedly when you had that contact from Syracuse, where was the other side of the contact? Syracuse to, did you say upstate New York? Or?
Sorry, he's muted again.
Oh, okay.
Go ahead, Ed.
Sorry. Yeah, Queens, New York, all the way about 250 miles.
Okay. That was what I needed. I needed the miles. So the CB operates on affectionately the 11-meter band. That's what it's called anyway. And that, to be able to have long distance comms on that frequency set usually requires to be at the high side of the 11-year sun cycle. That's when you get those really long contacts that people get with CB. We're on the other side of that cycle. We're on the bottom end of that cycle. So CB is less popular than it normally is. 5 years from now, people are going to start getting back on CB, and the other bands of amateur radio will be really popular again, like 10 meters that was mentioned earlier. It's a bit different on what causes that. That's a yearly phenomenon called sporadic E. But amateur radio, the advantage of amateur radio is it's sun cycle proof. We can just hop to lower bands down the frequency space, and we can pick back up that long distance comm. So I'm generally operating on 7 megahertz through, and then the other band I operate is on 14 megahertz, whereas CB, I believe, is down in 29 megahertz, I believe. And so that's kind of that separation will change the antenna I'm using and give me a bit longer throw with my signals. But good point, CB is still completely valid. People just may want to get into where you have a little bit more privileges.
All right, next up we have Vanessa.
Hi. I really know nothing about this subject, but I'm very interested, so I'm sorry if my question is a little one I should already know. Is your location traceable, and is there any record of your conversations?
Good question.
So I would say just consider yes, but your cell phone signal is traceable, right? And so is all the information that we give out to Google and however else. But let me be more specific. If for some reason you were to just be having a good chat with your friends on a repeater, and you're holding that thing down for, I don't know, give or take 2 minutes. If someone was really dead set on finding your location, they could do what's called radio triangulation, and all radios suffer from this. So, take this for what it's worth. But yeah, I have an antenna that would allow me to basically find where the highest intensity point is, and then I kind of just aim in that line, take a bearing, run that bearing across a map as a straight line, and then I can do this, or someone else can do this at the same time. Walk over quarter mile and do the same thing. Take the bearing from this direction. And once we get 2 bearings of crossing lines, well, that's the triangle. That's where the triangulation comes from. So once those 2 lines intersect, I get a pretty good idea where you are. And if you continue to transmit, then I can get closer and closer until, yeah, I'm basically right there. And that's a good question that I didn't really answer before, is kind of how does amateur radio self-police, and how do we maintain this decorum? It's, well, because we can all triangulate each other. It's not difficult to do this once you learn about these techniques. It's very simple. In fact, there's sporting events that are based off of direction finding. And it's really popular. It's basically like a foot race where you have radios and you run from transmitter to transmitter and try to be the first one to find all the transmitters in a given event. Fantastic fun. But yeah, if you continue to transmit on one frequency, then yes, people can find you. That's why we try and follow the guidelines, the FCC guidelines of using your call sign at the appropriate times. Try to maintain a certain level of decorum and that whole thing that goes along with it. I think that was your question. Was there another part to that? Can they direction find you? Oh, and is it recorded? Yeah. Okay. So repeaters nowadays are internet enabled. Many of them are. And so if not, what that allows is, even though most of this is RF in the chain, there will be, your radio to that repeater, and then that repeater may get on the internet and connect with other repeaters. And so then you have all these repeaters connected together and all talking. Well, when you do that, people get really interested in listening, and either that repeater system or the people that can receive that repeater will open up what's called like a Broadcastify, broadcastify.com. They will make a radio station devoted to specific repeaters because they're interesting or they have a lot of activity. And that can be recorded and that can be on the internet. As far as just recording things that you hear, a lot of my radios have the capability to record. So yeah, I could do that if I wanted to.
All right, next up is Dave, Alpha Charlie 0 Romeo Victor. You are unmutable now.
Okay, can y'all hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good evening, Josh. I'm a failure. I'm not a failure. I was reading the chat line, but I am a big fan of your show. Appreciate all the emergency preparedness stuff. Now, I don't know if it was you or if it was one of your other competitors. What kind of mounts do you use for your mobile setup?
What kind of mount?
Yeah, I don't know if you mentioned the amount of one of the radios you had in your one of your vehicles.
Yes, I use two. They're both from the Diamond brand, though. Diamond makes a mounting system that also has coax attached to it. I generally recommend that. I'm scrolling through some slides that I did on a show not too long ago. I did a live stream called Mobile VHF, UHF, and HF Setups, mobile implying putting HF into a vehicle. And I'm looking for what it is. The K400C. The K400C is by Diamond, is what I use right now on my screwdriver antenna. I know I'm getting into a little detail here, but that antenna allows me to do HF radio from my car, and that supports 6 meters through 40 meters. Diamond also makes a very similar mount. It's a little bit smaller and thus cheaper, and that's what I use for my VHF UHF radio. That model number I don't know, but if you can look up the K400C, C as in Charlie, you'll be able to find the other one, I imagine. And Diamond's pretty highly regarded. I've been using those mounts for over a decade now, and they've been really satisfactory.
Awesome. Next question is from Joseph Bullock. Oh, let's try that again. There you go.
Nope. Thanks, guys, and thank you for hosting, and thank you for joining us, Josh. I just have a question. Was there one habit that maybe you mentioned a fear of failure in the beginning? Is there one habit that you would point to that would help you, that has helped you getting past your either perfectionism or your fear of failure? Like the better is the enemy of good. You know, I remember that comment that you had made. So, you know, is there one thing that maybe?
I think I don't know that it was habit. I'm sure that, you know, let me just say, the more you do that, the more it would build those connections in your brain that you should be doing that and incentivize you to continue doing that. But at the same time, more or less, why I did it was I really didn't have a lot of other option. I value my time, and I'm usually a very busy person working full time, and I couldn't really take the time to stay home one day to have somebody come to my house, a professional, and have them work on something. So I thought to myself, well, instead of just having one person come for 4 hours and knock the project out, I'm fine doing an hour every night over the course of a week and solve my problem. Now, I'm not talking about like a mainline sewer stoppage or anything like that, but, you know, small things. Like I would kind of line myself up to do a project, and I would just keep reminding myself, hey, it's still cheaper for me to do this, even buying all these cool tools, than it is to pay a professional to come out and do it. Now, I appreciate that the quality of the work that I do is not nearly up to the professional level, particularly when I started out doing it. But at the same time, I wouldn't let that stop me. I don't know if it was one particular habit. Maybe it's a tool collecting problem that I have that may have led me down that road. I don't know, but maybe it's just because I was on my own and kind of had to just learn to do it on my own, and kind of turned into that skid a bit. I wish I had a better answer for that, to be honest.
So I have two last questions for you that came up during this Q&A, and then we will wrap up. One, what's the most interesting contact you've ever made?
Probably New Zealand on voice. That was fun. where was another one? Airplane Mobile. That was another good one. Pilots have HF radios in the cockpit. And so I was able to communicate with a pilot that was operating over Colorado, I think. So we had a conversation there. He was very busy. Once they hear Airplane Mobile, just all these hams start getting on the band, and you can hear them going crazy. I did. Oh, you know what? It was actually when I went to go out and talk to Mike Glover when they had me out. It happened to be a contest weekend. We didn't go into a lot of detail on contests, but it's kind of a radio sport thing. Usually it's over the course of a weekend, people try to make as many contacts as they can. And there's a ranking system, people get awards. It's a lot of fun. And I happened to be in a hotel room. I had my 5-watt, what they call QRP. That's a Q code for low power. Q codes are little abbreviations we use when we're doing Morse code. And I had this tiny little little radio with a tiny antenna, and I was in a hotel room. And for the heck of it, I set it up. I didn't really know. I didn't think I would get anybody. It's this dinky little vertical antenna. The radio puts out 10 watts of power at most, which is a paltry sum. And it was during the contest weekend, and I'm listening. You'll listen fine. You'll hear a lot of stuff, but it's the transmitting that becomes difficult. And I'm listening for frequency, people talking, and I hear this JA call. So I'm KI, Kilo India 6, this Juliet Alpha call starts coming out. And if you're familiar with amateur radio call signs, that's Japan. And I'm like, oh, a Japanese call sign. And it was this worldwide DX contest, which is long distance contacts contest. And I was like, what the heck? I was having breakfast. I'll call them. And not the first time, not the second time, but the third time they heard me and they called me back, and we were able to complete a QSO. And so and QSO is ham radio speak for contact, fancy terms. And so it was from Prescott, Arizona to Japan on 10 watts of power output, which is really mind-boggling to me. So that's still probably I was most excited when I completed that contact.
Wow, that's pretty cool. Okay, so then my other question is, I guess, more technical in nature. Are there man-portable HF rigs? Like, could you have an HF system that you can walk with while you're using it?
Yes.
I mean, I've seen HF rigs where like somebody will set it up on a park bench. Right? That's not what I'm talking about. I mean, you can literally be on the move while it's on your back while you're using it.
Yes, it's called man-pack portable radios.
Okay.
So almost any radio can be a man-pack portable radio. It really just depends on how much power output you're putting out and how close you want to be to that power output, because radio frequency is an electromagnetic wave, and it can give you a surface burn. It's not it's non-ionizing radiation, so it's not going to cause cancer. But if you get too close to it, if you're putting out enough power, you can get a bit of a burn. With that said, most of the man-pack portable stuff is like 5 watts output. Again, talking about the radio that I used to talk to Japan, about 5 watts, maybe 10 watts. You can absolutely do that. They make vertical antennas that, shoot up however many feet into the air. The problem is that you generally have to have a radial, what they call a radial. And that's usually a wire that you drag behind you as you're hiking along the trail. That can work okay in certain situations. Where I live, there's too much bushes and everything else to get caught up in this wire that you're dragging. So that makes man-pack portable possible. I've seen it's very easy to do if you're on like a beach, because the salt water and the salinity of the water gives you really good counterpoise to making contacts with your antenna. But I guess the important thing, and this can kind of get into some detail, why do you have to drag a wire behind you? Well, hopefully you're all familiar with what coax wire looks like. Coax wire has like a center pin connector, right? And then there's like a collar, and that collar is usually sitting on top of a braided wire that goes around that center connector, and it's separated by insulation. Well, those are the two parts of an antenna, right? There's the side that is your kind of your transmitting side, your center pin, and then there's the return side, which is the other portion. And that's generally the simplest antenna, is just two wires, the center pin out of the coax and the shield out of the coax. We call that a dipole antenna. Well, a vertical is just taking that dipole, the positive side and the negative side, and then standing it up. And the positive side becomes the vertical radiating element that you're familiar as like a whip on an antenna, like the handy talkie here. And that negative side needs to have connection to the ground or be close to the ground. And that's called your radial, or in some cases, your counterpoise. And that's the part of the radio when you're doing vertical antennas that needs to drag behind you or be connected. Now, there's another antenna called a loop antenna, but that is literally a big, like, hula hoop size thing that, you don't really want that by your head as you're transmitting, particularly Manpack Portable. But if you look up Manpack Portable, you'll find a pretty interesting history. They would use Alice packs, vintage military surplus Alice pack frames, and they would mount radios kind of on their chest with the screens facing up to them so they could twiddle the knobs and all that stuff. I don't do that so much. I put the radio in my backpack. I hike to a really scenic spot. I sit down, make myself some coffee, and play radio. just in that situation.
Cool. Okay. Well, that's going to be my new project. I like rucking a lot, so I'll put weight in the backpack and just hike and walk. I would love to, like you said, play radio while getting some exercise in. So that's going to be one of my projects down the road here. All right, Josh, thank you so much for coming on the Switch podcast. I really appreciate this. If people are interested in following up with you, I know we keep mentioning the YouTube channel. I only said the name of it one time.
Yeah.
Where can people find you?
Yeah, it's my own account. I totally spaced on mentioning it. Really good job. It's the Ham Radio Crash Course on YouTube. So I have the YouTube show. I have a podcast that I do with my wife. She is not licensed, and so that is so much fun because she just asks a lot of questions, but more often than not, just kind of makes fun of me in a nice way on this kind of radio hobby thing as I'm walking her through it. She's trying to get her license. We have a Facebook group. It's also called the Ham Radio Crash Course. We have a very, very active Discord, which is awesome because it tends a little bit younger. The community is a little bit younger, and they're very, very active. And then I'm, all over Instagram. I've even been doing some TikTok videos on ham radio. I don't know how that's really possible, but again, my wife kind of helps me out on that stuff. But yeah, YouTube, Ham Radio Crash Course will kind of get you to all those things if you're interested in kind of not just learning about it, but trying to find a community of people that are very in tune with helping each other. My big push has been to create an inclusive environment for people to learn more about radio, and that, going along with the it's okay to fail, it's okay to ask dumb questions. You think they're dumb, but they're often not dumb. You're probably just asking a question that other people have asked, or some people have just been too afraid to ask. So we try to make an environment where it's completely okay to raise those questions, and we try and work with everybody.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Josh. Any final thoughts, Alex or Josh, as we wrap up here?
I'm just going back to that DDoS thing. I don't know if anybody followed that at all. Was anybody impacted by that? We lost the ability to make phone calls today. That denial of service attack that took out a bunch of service providers. It literally happened like an hour or two before we got on this podcast. So I was like, whoa, there's a topic. There's a thing to talk about.
Interesting. I'll have to look it up. All
yeah,
right.
check it out.
Alex?
No, I didn't hear about that. I wasn't affected, to my knowledge.
Cool. All right. Well, we will wrap it up here and hand it back to Shrikant for the rest of the meetup. Josh, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Josh. Thank you very much, Chase and Alex.